Introducing one of these individuals, Andrew Cayley, who will be presenting his keynote address entitled Proving Crimes Against Humanity. Andrew Cayley was born in the United Kingdom in 1964. Mr. Cayley studied at Brighton College and subsequently earned his LLB and LLM from the University College London. He was admitted as solicitor of the Supreme Court of the Judicature of England and Wales in 1989. Mr. Cayley briefly worked in private practice following his graduation before completing an officer's course and working as a legal officer for the British Army. During his Army service, Mr. Cayley acted as military prosecutor and command legal advisor in Germany and the UK. After his military service, he was appointed to the office of the prosecutor in the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, acting as prosecutor general and then senior prosecuting counsel. In that capacity, he was responsible for the case against General Ratko Mladic and led the first prosecution of members of the Kosovo Liberation Army. From 2005 to 2007, Mr. Cayley served as the senior prosecuting counsel at the International Criminal Court, where he led the Darfur investigations. Mr. Cayley's service has also led him to work as a defense attorney before the Special Court for Sierra Leone and the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. In 2009, Mr. Cayley was appointed co-prosecutor of the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, where he presently serves. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Cayley.
I think it's probably rather ambitious to call this a keynote speech because, as you know, many of you will know, Ambassador Hans Corell, the former legal advisor to the United Nations, was supposed to give this address, but he unfortunately got delayed as a result of the storms along the East Coast, and I think is still stuck in Sweden, but I'm told he will come next year. So this, I have to tell you, is a bit of a jerry-rigged presentation that I'm doing. It's really concerning a case in which I was involved, which I think probably is the case that more profoundly affected me than any other prosecution I've been involved in. And it had certain elements to it which were unique, actually, in prosecuting these kinds of crimes. It was a case I realize now I was actually involved in now over 10 years ago. It was the first prosecution for events in Srebrenica in Bosnia in July of 1995. At that time I was what we call in England junior counsel. I was being led by an American prosecutor called Mark Harmon, who was a very distinguished prosecutor at the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal, now retired. We prosecuted this case together with another individual called Peter McCloskey, who's actually currently prosecuting the Ratko Mladic case, General Ratko Mladic, who was arrested this year in Serbia, and also another Australian prosecutor called Magda Karagiannakis. Obviously the team was much larger than that. But I think this was a particularly, a case which I think particularly affected me because of the victims community, which we'll touch on a bit, and also because of the forensic evidence in the case. You know, as I said to you, in Cambodia we're dealing with crimes that are nearly 30 years old. Any kind of physical forensic evidence is now just skeletons, many of which are now enclosed in memorial sites within Cambodia, whereas with this particular crime, because it actually happened during the existence of the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal, we were able to actually eventually, not immediately because there were access problems, but by 1998, I think probably even earlier than that, 97, 98, we were actually in the region where the crimes had taken place, and we were literally digging up the bodies and eventually using that as evidence in the case. My two principal responsibilities in this case were the forensic evidence and the command structure evidence. So essentially, because of my military background, Harman had me trying to basically sort out and understand the military command structure, obviously using experts. We had an in-house expert called Richard Butler, who was a former warrant officer in the US Army, and he did a lot of this work. Together with external experts, we had a British Major General who came in and gave evidence on the military structures to the judges. But those were my two main responsibilities, and that's actually what I'll touch on in this presentation. So that's actually, that's actually an exhumed, one of the exhumed graves. It's it's a photograph that obviously leaves a lasting impression. You'll see it later. It's actually a particular site called Kozluk. But first of all, what I will do for the benefit of everybody here, and I do apologise to my professional colleagues who worked on linked cases, who know this evidence as well as me, but obviously we have a mixed audience of people here. Not everybody familiar with the war in Yugoslavia or indeed the work of the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal. This was the fact basis of this particular case. It arose out of the conflict in Bosnia-Herzegovina from 1990 onwards, war coming to an end in the mid-90s. It involved the fall of the Srebrenica enclave in July of 1995, and I'll show you that on a map. The principal criminal act, there were other crimes committed, but the main criminal act was the murder, the unlawful killing of over 8,000 men aged between 16 and 60 years of age. Bear in mind that this was in 1999 when this prosecution started. That figure has increased. Off the top of my head, I don't know what it is now, but at the time, that was the figure that we knew, that it was upwards of 8,000, but that increased, and indeed, you'll see later, we only recovered, in fact, the remains of 2,000 individuals. Many thousands more have been recovered in the last 15 years for the purposes, essentially, of identifying them and informing their relatives. All of those human remains are actually stored in a salt mine underneath the city of Tuzla. We charged this act as genocide and the crimes against humanity of extermination, murder and persecution, and we also charged murder as a war crime. We also charged the forcible movement of the civilian population of upwards of 25,000 people as the crime against humanity of deportation. So in this case, the two main criminal acts committed by Serb forces in Srebrenica was the unlawful killing of upwards of 8,000 men, together with the forcible displacement of the rest of the population out of Srebrenica, women, children and the elderly, out of Srebrenica and into Bosnian Muslim-controlled areas. That's actually a piece that was written by an American judge, Patricia Wald. She wrote the judgment, many of the best parts actually of the trial judgment. She wrote beautifully. She does still write beautifully. She's retired now. But she did 2 years at the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal, and we were really fortunate to have her on this case because she was an extremely experienced appellate judge from the DC circuit. She really had enormous experience of dealing with complex trials, and these courts don't always have the best qualified judges. We were very, very fortunate to have her as the judge in this case, and this is what she wrote, and if you can't read it, the events of the 9 days from July 10th to July 19th, 1995 in Srebrenica defy description in their horror and their implication for humankind's capacity to revert to acts of brutality under the stresses of conflict. In little over 1 week, thousands of lives were extinguished, irreparably rent, or simply wiped from the pages of history. And that, if you get the opportunity to go on the website, I recommend that you actually read the first 3 pages of this judgment because it's beautifully written and it really encapsulates what happened in Srebrenica. Just for those less familiar with the region, again, apologies to my professional colleagues, that is the municipality of Srebrenica. in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And by July of 1995, this was an area which literally had a sort of enclave within an enclave. So within that municipality, there was a tiny area where there were about 50,000 Bosnian Muslims completely surrounded by Bosnian Serb forces. You can see the strategic position of Srebrenica. It's on the border with Serbia. And one of the Serbian war aims during the Yugoslav conflict was to essentially eliminate that border so that the Serbs living in Bosnia would essentially be contiguous with the Serbs living in Serbia proper. And this was one of the few Bosnian Muslim enclaves on the border with Serbia by July of 1995. Serb forces needed to remove it. Most of the people that were in the enclave were civilians. There were some armed Bosnian Muslim armed forces, but the majority of the people were civilian males and women and children. Now, as I said, one of the very important things about this case, and fairly unique in terms of war crimes cases, at least at that time in 1999, in the first case I did, the Blaškić case, there was absolutely no forensic evidence at all, but in this case we presented a great deal. And you can see that the court actually found that extremely compelling for a number of reasons, and I'll list those out. But basically they made the overall statement that the forensic evidence presented by the prosecution provides corroboration of survivor testimony that following the takeover of Srebrenica in July of 1995, thousands of Bosnian Muslim men from Srebrenica were killed in careful and methodical mass executions. Now, we had to obviously try and demonstrate that this number of people had been murdered. We had to counter the defense position that many of these people were combat casualties. There were people who had been killed in combat. Now, you'll see from the evidence that I show you that it wasn't absolutely conclusive, but one of the most conclusive things that we were able to present was the fact that many of the primary grave sites where people had been buried after being executed were robbed. So in other words, Serb forces executed individuals, buried the bodies, and then when international media, when your Secretary of State at the time basically released photography, aerial photography, indicating that there had been locations where people had been buried, the Serb forces went back, dug the bodies up, and put them in secondary graves. Obviously, you wouldn't bother doing that if they were combat casualties. But you'll see some of the evidence that we were able to adduce in respect of these particular grave sites. We exhumed 21 grave sites in connection with what happened in Srebrenica. 14 were primary, so in other words, after people had been executed, they were placed in those particular grave sites. Eight of those grave sites were proven to have been robbed. Now, just to put it in perspective, there were many, many more grave sites in connection with Srebrenica than 21. We subsequently, I think, exhumed about another 10, and then the Bosnian authorities went on exhuming grave sites. Obviously, there are grave sites across Bosnia, not just linked to Srebrenica. But this was the limit of what we did for the first trial. 7 sites were proven to have been secondary sites, so where the bodies had been robbed and then placed in another grave site. At that time, we established that there were a minimum of 2,028 bodies that we could identify from these sites. The reason the figure was quite low was because obviously in a number of the grave sites, particularly the secondary sites, and you'll see from the photography that I'll show you, it was actually very difficult sometimes because the bodies were what's called commingled. You know, they were so decomposed. And there were just literally bits and pieces. And we had to, in some instances, try and actually, put bodies back together. I mean, I know it sounds absolutely hideous, but that's what we had to engage in order to, 1, to try and identify people, and 2, try and actually establish numbers. Obviously, it was a lot easier in the primary grave sites to establish numbers of bodies because the graves hadn't been disturbed. We were able to, obviously, very importantly, not just for the case, but for the relatives, we were able to positively identify people from items that they had on their person. In some instances, I mean, very distressing, things like photographs of children, gifts from loved ones, and that was very, very sad when that was handed over to a relative. But because of that, obviously, we were able to identify many of these people as having been inhabitants of Srebrenica prior to the fall in July of '95. We were able to establish that people were of Muslim ethnicity. These were Bosnian Muslims who'd been murdered because a significant number of them had tracts of the Quran, put into their inside pocket. We were able to corroborate the demographic evidence that the overwhelming majority of the total missing from Srebrenica were men, because that is essentially when we had a demographics expert go through all of the Red Cross lists to establish who was missing. At the end of the war, we could obviously match that with the fact that all of the bodies we were pulling out were men, and he had done the same thing, that the majority of the missing from Srebrenica were men. We were also able to corroborate the evidence that he had managed to formulate on the age ranges of individuals. So the forensic pathologist essentially assessing the age of the body actually broadly matched the demographics that were established from the Red Cross list of the people that were missing from Srebrenica. Again, we were able to corroborate the fact that many of the bodies were not combat casualties, and you'll see why in a moment. We found, and again, I accept, by itself these facts are not conclusive because we're talking about 2,000 bodies, but we were able to recover 448 blindfolds, so the bodies were wearing blindfolds. 423 ligatures at 13 sites, 448 blindfolds at 10 sites. So we were able to recover bodies where the hands were literally tied. Now, of course, people going into combat are not blindfolded, with their hands tied behind their back. I mean, that's a classic execution. And the robbed sites, which I've mentioned already, demonstrated a concerted effort to actually conceal the crime. Now, this was at the time, and this is quite an interesting slide from the point of view of history. At the time, we were looking at this man here, General Major Radislav Krstić, who was then the commander of the Drina Corps, and his superiors at that time had not been arrested. They'd been charged but not arrested. General Ratko Mladic and Dr. Radovan Karadzic, now both in custody at the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal, both of whom have been charged with this event, one of whom is currently on trial, the top guy, Dr. Radovan Karadzic, the president and supreme commander of the Bosnian Serb forces, General Ratko Mladic, who was the commander or the chief of staff of the Bosnian Serb forces. He's just been arrested, as many of you will know, this year, and he will be facing trial, I think, next year. So the individual that we were looking at was this man, Major General Radislav Krstić, who was a corps commander in the Bosnian Serb forces in this particular area, and many of his units were actually involved in these particular crimes, and other units as well, to be fair to Krstić, but a number of his units were engaged. One of the issues that arose very early on in the trial, and this is actually quite an interesting document, obviously this is a translation of the original, which was in the Serbian language, is that Krstić essentially denied being the commander during the period of the executions, and he said that he simply had not been appointed. And at the beginning of the trial, we couldn't prove conclusively that he had been the commander. We did in fact have an order, which I'll show you in a minute, which he issued on the 13th of July, which is the period, 13th of July 1995, which was the period that actually led into the executions, but we couldn't prove conclusively that he had been appointed. Interestingly, until the end of the trial, when we were provided with this document, which, just refreshing my memory this morning and reading the judgment, the judges found very convincing, and it basically was a recording by the administrative officer of the Corps, recording the handover of command from the former commander whose name was General Jovanovic, passing command to General Krstić. And the judges, interestingly, went through all of the defense position, the prosecution position, backwards and forwards, and then actually concluded, on the basis of this document, Krstić must have assumed command of the Drina Corps on the 13th of July of 1995. Now, this was the other document which was also issued by Krstić on the 13th of July of 1995, signing as commander. Now, for me, and it says command of the Drina Corps, and having been an army officer, I mean, I looked at this and I remember telling Mark Harmon, look, I mean, if you sign a document headed command of the Drina Corps, so the Corps, the headquarters of the Corps, as the commander, you are the commander of the Corps. But one of the difficulties, which has often been in a number of these courts, dealing with military matters, is that not all judges have military experience. And when the accused, when his defense essentially said, well, actually, he wasn't signing as the commander of the Drina Corps, he was actually signing as the commander of the Žepa group. And this was an entirely fictional unit that Krstić had essentially made up in order to try and convince the judges that he wasn't the commander. But after all of the evidence had been heard, and indeed we had an expert, a British divisional commander coming in and saying, look, this means that the man was the commander of the Corps. It doesn't mean anything else. If he was the commander of the Žepa group, it would have said, Commander Žepa group. Next, what I'll show you, and this is also quite interesting, you can see at the bottom, there's a handwritten part, and then it says 13 July, 8 o'clock, 20-30 hours illegible signature. Now, when I first saw the original document, I recognised it immediately because the British Army does this exactly the same way. It was basically the signaller's stamp as to when this order was transmitted. So Krstić writes the order, the clerk types it up, he signs it, and then it goes to a communications centre and it's transmitted to all of the units in the Corps. And if you look at the original, those are the two originals, you will see, interestingly, that those documents were basically sent out by the same signaller, and I think one is sent at 20:35, so at 8:35, and the other is sent at 8:30, and the signatures, actually they were examined by document examiners, are identical. So those two documents actually went to the communications centre at the same time, which would make sense because Krstić was issuing his first operational order as commander of the Drina Corps, and at the same time notice was going around to all of the units in the Corps that he was now the head man, he was the Corps commander. So looked at together, those two documents were extremely important. Now, I think I showed you a moment ago the border between Bosnia proper and Serbia. And we were also able to show with political documents the strategic objectives of the Bosnian Serbs. And you can see there the second objective that they had, the Serbian people in Bosnia, was to establish a corridor in the Drina River Valley, that is eliminating the Drina as a border between the two Serbian states. So they expressly stated that as a political objective, that they basically wanted to eliminate that border and so that Serbian people essentially would be contiguous across that border. And they stated it in a document. And that document's been used many times. It's signed by Momcilo Krajišnik, who was the president of the Serbian Assembly, also tried by the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal. I think he was sentenced, I think it's about 2 years ago now. Very, very long trial, and I think eventually, I can't remember the sentence, but I think it's at least something like 35 years. Maybe somebody in the audience will know. But so the gentleman that signed that was subsequently tried and convicted. Now, this is also quite an interesting order. This is an order from the main staff of the Bosnian Serb army. So, in essence, the unit above Krstić's. And it's issued in 1992, and it's to the commander, the chief of staff personally, and it's an operational directive. So it's basically, again, a military strategic document. And the document, amongst other things, orders the Drina Corps. So Krstić's unit, the man who's on trial in this case that we're talking about, at the time Krstić was the second in command of the Drina Corps, and it orders the Corps to basically attack the population, and it's talking here about Bosnian Muslims, and force him to leave the Berat, Žepa and Gorazda areas together with the Muslim population. So this was a military order directed not just at Bosnian Muslim combatants, but also at the population. It was literally directed at the civilian population. Now, This is an order that was issued 3 months before the attack on Srebrenica. And you can see again it's an order to the Drina Corps. Krstić is still the deputy commander. The man I mentioned earlier, Jovanovic, is the commander. And these are the orders that are given from the Supreme Command, so from Karadzic's level to the Drina Corps. And the order, and I'll read the last few lines, they're ordered to maintain or to pursue the complete physical separation of Srebrenica from Žepa. Žepa was another Muslim enclave just south of Srebrenica. Should be carried out as soon as possible, preventing even communication between individuals in the two enclaves. By planned and well thought out combat operations, create an unbearable situation of total insecurity with no hope of further survival or life for the inhabitants of Srebrenica and Žepa. I mean, a very telling order, an illegal order, an order absolutely clear in what the objective of the military forces was in Srebrenica. It was basically to create a humanitarian catastrophe in that enclave and to force the population out. And of course, we presented this directive to the judges, a very powerful piece of evidence. I was always astonished that it was actually recorded in writing, this particular directive. Now, interestingly, the Drina Corps, in response to that order, issues its own order, but in much, much more conservative language, and basically orders the Drina Corps to split apart the enclaves of Žepa and Srebrenica and to reduce them to their urban areas. So nothing about creating a condition of total insecurity with no hope of further survival in life. That is actually subsequently what happened. This is a much more sort of clinical order without any indication of criminality as such within it. So, in essence, this is the Srebrenica enclave. And you can see, I mean, if I just, this is basically the enclave here. So all of the Bosnian Muslim population was in that area. It was protected by a very small UN protection force. A lot has been written about this. It was a Dutch unit which was under strength, not properly equipped to deal with a full-scale Bosnian Serb Army Corps attack. That UN protection disappeared very quickly. There was also confusion within Sarajevo and in Zagreb about the use of air force, and essentially the UN didn't react properly. There was very little air support for the Dutch forces that were in that pocket. Some of you may have been following over the years, a number of Bosnian Muslims have been pursuing the Dutch government to sue them essentially for civil damages in the courts in the Netherlands. And I think there has recently been a successful case actually brought by the son of two individuals who were killed in Srebrenica, his mother and father, who were killed. A lot of these Dutch officers actually gave evidence during the trial. The problem, I think, that they really had, the Dutch, is that they were, at that time, a conscripted army. So many of these kids that were in this enclave, unlike the British or the US Army, which of course are volunteer armies, people that actually want to serve in the military forces, many of these kids were doing a year national service and they really didn't want to take on the Serbs. So the defense basically collapsed very quickly. That red line there, on the night of the 10th of July of 1995, the male population, 15,000 men, basically left the enclave as the Bosnian Serbs were closing in because they were extremely concerned that they would basically suffer the fate which many of them eventually did, that the Bosnian Serbs would basically kill many of them. Within that group of 15,000 people, there were, I think, as my memory serves me, about 2,000 fighters. So at the front end, there were Bosnian Muslim combatants who basically pushed a hole through Bosnian Serb forces, but behind that, there were the best part of about 12 or 13,000 unarmed civilian males aged between 16 and 60 years of age, basically fleeing the enclave. And that line basically indicates the route of flight. Most of them were captured at the bottom end of that red line as they came out. The Serbs essentially on one side basically set up a sort of an offensive line so that the Bosnian Muslims were walking along a ridge, and the Bosnian Serbs set up an offensive position along this line, and they started to shell the column as it was fleeing, and many people simply came down and surrendered to them. They often actually, there's video footage of this, they would capture somebody and then they would use the relatives to basically, the Serbs would get them to shout up and tell them to come down. So many people were captured literally as they left, as they fled from Srebrenica. The total number captured, actually, nobody really knows. There are very, very few survivors. We'll talk about that in a moment. I mean, I think there's literally a handful. I can't remember the exact numbers. I mean, we had, of the survivors, I think we had about sort of 15 or 20 people testifying, who had been in the column, who had been captured and escaped. Very, very, very few people survived. But I think probably a few thousand, other than the combat forces, actually did make it north here to Bosnian-controlled territory. One of the interesting things about this particular trial, which we didn't have in the first trial in which I was involved at the ISTY, is there was an awful lot of journalistic media attention. So there were Bosnian Serb journalists in Srebrenica as this was happening. So here you have men in Potocari, which was the UN compound within the Srebrenica enclave. This was the town where the Dutch forces had their headquarters. And this is actually video footage that was being taken by Bosnian Serb journalists, literally as these men were being separated by Bosnian Serb forces. And as the years went by, my understanding, talking to people that did further cases, that even more material became available. I mean, some of it extremely probative of the crimes, literally photographic video footage of bodies literally piled up next to execution sites, which we didn't have available to us in this first trial. Now, this also was a unique aspect of this particular case. The US government essentially provided to us aerial photography taken at the time over Srebrenica and the surrounding areas, and you'll probably recall that Madeleine Albright essentially went to the media with these aerial photographs saying, look, we know what's happened. We do know what's happened, which actually caused the Bosnian Serbs to then start digging up all of the grave sites. But we were able to use a lot of this material in the first prosecution. It was declassified by the US government. And frankly, I mean, this is some of the best evidence I've ever seen in any case. And there you can actually see, I mean, this is on the 12th of July, so the Bosnian Serb forces have basically overrun the enclave. They're moving sort of stranglehold around the enclave within Srebrenica. And here you can see people, that's a group of people outside the UN compound trying to get in. People were absolutely terrified. And you can see those factories, that large sort of warehouse on the left-hand side. Many people went to that building, but people were desperately trying to get into the UN compound because they were seeking the protection of the UN forces. And essentially the Dutch had to close the gates because there were so many people. In that warehouse, and I actually was involved in the interview of a number of witnesses there, many people fled to that location because they couldn't get inside the UN compound. And of the men, there were a number of men who had not fled with the main column, who were stuck in that warehouse. And a number of these people, they were so terrified that they committed suicide by hanging themselves in the rafters. So you can imagine there are families gathered in this place seeking refuge, and then you've got male members of the population so terrified of the Bosnian Serb forces coming that people literally, hanged themselves. And I had one Dutch soldier describe the scene, and he described it in the trial. I mean, a horrible, horrible scene with small children running around and crying, and these bodies literally swinging from the tops of the rafters in this factory site. You can't see that very well, but in the background you can see smoke rising. I was actually given this photograph on the day a Dutch soldier came to testify, and we had written down evidence from witnesses at the time, so from Bosnian Muslim witnesses, that the men who had not fled with the column and had gone to Potocari and who had been arrested by the Bosnian Serb forces, and all of those men were subsequently executed, their belongings, they all said that their belongings had been taken away from them at the time. But we didn't have any other evidence, physical evidence of these belongings. And in fact, that photograph, the Dutch soldier showed it to me and he said, well, that's where they actually took all the belongings of all of these individuals and they literally put them in a massive pile, poured gasoline over them just to destroy any sort of record of these people's personal belongings, identity cards, clothes, suitcases, just literally up in smoke. And here was a photograph that he literally handed to me the day that he was about to give evidence. So evidence came in as we were prosecuting the case, which often happens in these very large cases. That square that you see in the middle of that sort of field surrounded by hedges is actually a group of men, males from the column who'd been captured. Now, obviously we had experts, people, military photographic image experts who can look at these photographs and say, yes, that's a group of people. And that's a group of people gathered on a football field on the 13th of July, just outside the town of Srebrenica. And the interesting other piece of evidence that we had, and I know you want me to read that, but that is a transcript of an intercept. The Bosnian Serb forces were extremely careless about radio communication security. So oftentimes they were either speaking on open military telephone lines or over open radio transmission. And in this particular radio intercept, and I won't read it for you, but take my word for it, it's a conversation between two officers within the Bosnian Serb army, essentially confirming that there is a group of individuals on a football field. I mean, they call it a playground here, it's poor translation. And that's actually referring to the individuals I've just shown you, because that was a football field in Nova Kasaba. And these guys were basically stating, yes, there's a group of captured individuals on a football field. On some occasions, interestingly, they do actually say, I don't know whether they say it on this one, they do actually say, shut up, be careful what you're saying, because this is an open line and people may be listening. And in fact, the people that were listening were Bosnian Muslim forces quite some way away. And they were basically listening on an old VHF radio, and they had basically reel-to-reel tape recorders just constantly recording all of the transmissions that were being picked up. And we discovered these intercepts by accident in the basement of a military headquarters in Sarajevo. And what had happened is that they'd converted it into sort of usable intelligence by having individuals literally sitting there with headphones and writing out a transcript in a school exercise book. They were literally sat there all day writing out what they could hear from these transmissions. So we then had to have translators go through all of the hundreds of these books to basically look at the relevant dates when this happened and pull out this material. And it was a very rich source of evidence, and things sort of corroborated each other backwards and forwards. So the photographs corroborated the radio transmission, the intercepted radio transmissions corroborated the photographs. That's another, you can see the group here. I actually had a survivor who was at this site, and he actually described this. I didn't show him the photograph until he was actually in the courtroom, but he was able to describe this scene. And then once he'd done it without the aid of the photograph, we literally pulled this photograph out, showed the judges, and absolutely he described being at the end, and he described these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, these 6 coaches, those white squares that you can see. These were coaches that were used to essentially transport the captured male Muslims to the execution sites. He was literally able to describe that scene almost perfectly. And then we produced the photograph, which absolutely corroborated his evidence. Again, this is another one where they're openly talking about men. I'll read this one. Well, tell them right away to come. There are about 6,000 of them out. Of military age, shut up, don't repeat. At each point, roughly 1,500 to 2,000. So again, they're talking about very significant numbers of individuals who've been captured, and they're also concerned about the fact that somebody might be listening, so he tells them to shut up. This is a report, an interesting report, from one of the brigades. So the brigade is a unit below the corps in the Bosnian Serb army structure. It's not like that actually in the British Army, but that's how they were set up. So the corps headquarters is here, this is Kirstich, and then underneath is the brigade structure. And this is a brigade commander reporting on the 15th of July, so the operation to round up all the Bosnian Muslims has been going on for about 48 hours, and he says, an additional burden for us is the large number of prisoners distributed throughout schools in the brigade area, as well as obligations of security and restoration of the terrain. The command cannot take care of these problems any longer, as it has neither the material nor other resources. If no one takes on this responsibility, I will be forced to let them go. Now, the interesting thing about this document, although it doesn't particularly incriminate this brigade commander, is that most of our survivor witnesses confirm that they had been taken to schools in the region, that after they had been captured, they'd been taken to a school, because this was an extremely rural area. And schools, frankly, other than sort of community halls, were the only large buildings where you could actually contain hundreds and indeed thousands of people. So most individuals, most of the survivors who gave evidence confirmed that they had been taken from a school. So they'd been captured, put in a bus, taken to a school, and then removed from the school to the execution site where they, for whatever reason, had survived. This is an interesting photograph. It's the Pilica Cultural Hall, which is the building in the middle that you can see with the pitched roof. There were actually no survivors from this building at all. It was a major execution site. There were about 2,000 people killed in that building. We were the first people to actually get into that building after it had been used. We went there in 1999. The execution took place 17 July 1995. The building had been locked after the bodies had been removed. We turned up in 1999, 4 years later. Investigators from the tribunal basically used bolt clippers to take the chains off the door. We went in, and you could absolutely see that there'd been a mass execution in this place. Why? Because the walls were absolutely riddled with the pock marks from gunfire. And then when you went up onto the stage, it was a community hall at the back, and we went under the stage, there was literally, blood had sort of congealed and dried under the stage. You could see just from the physical evidence on the ground that something absolutely terrible had happened in this place. And indeed, the only way ultimately that we proved that this was an execution site is that we had one of the he actually claimed that he'd not been involved in this particular execution, this particular episode, but he'd been present, a Bosnian Croat in the Bosnian Serb forces who'd been present when this particular episode took place, and he essentially confirmed, yes, a lot of people were rounded up in this building and then were basically executed by machine gun fire. So that's how we prove that, because there were no survivors from this site at all. This shows very briefly, and I won't go into detail on this, but the red little discs are primary grave sites, and the green are secondary grave sites. In other words, the primary grave sites, the red circles, they were dug up and the bodies were moved to the green sites. Now, we were able to essentially connect the bodies from the primary sites to the secondary sites by examining, obviously, the contents of the grave site. We managed to match soil, pollen samples and shell cases between the two sites in Glogovo 1 to Zeleni Yadar. We were also actually able to do it with material of blindfolds was found to be identical in both grave sites. Material used for ligatures was found to be identical in both grave sites. So we were able to make the match by essentially having experts examine material found in the secondary grave sites and matching it with the primary grave sites. Again, here, other things happened. For example, at Kozluk, this is quite an interesting one. Coslet was an execution site that was behind a bottling plant, and they executed people where a lot of the broken bottles from the bottling plant were just thrown away. And what they did is when they dug up the primary grave site, they basically dug up green glass from the bottling site, which we then discovered in all of these secondary grave sites. So pieces of smashed green glass. Again, shell cases, blindfolds, ligatures, soil pollen, all of this material which basically matched one grave site with another. This is the Coslet mass grave site. That's the photograph that I showed you at the beginning. There is, again, just to show you a body that we recovered, with a blindfold, demonstrating obviously that this was not, or providing a level of evidence that this individual was not a combat casualty. Again, another blindfold. And there, that's ligature obviously around somebody's hands, tied to their wrists. Another blindfold. That's an interesting one. That's actually, you can see the jawbone, the top of the cheekbone there on the left, and that's obviously the rear of the skull. Now, I led a lot of the forensic pathology, and as many of the lawyers in the room will know, you cannot assess distance that a shot has been fired at somebody unless the body's fleshed, because when a weapon is fired at close range to somebody, it leaves sort of a lot of the discharge on the skin, and when you don't have skin, you can't basically assess the distance. So the forensic pathologist giving evidence, a man called Dr. James Clark, was unable to say what distance somebody had been shot from, because obviously the bodies weren't fleshed any longer. But this was one where he was able to say, obviously this person was shot in the back of the head. And if you look at the literature, a lot of it actually comes from the US, from the Vietnam War. People in combat, generally are hit in the largest area. That's the target that somebody shoots at. They're normally, shot in the chest. It's very rare that you're in combat and you're shot in the back of the head. So whereas it didn't conclusively prove that this was an execution, it certainly seemed more like an execution than it did a combat injury to the head. This is Braniewo Farm. This was another execution site. This shows it on the 17th of July. And then this is the interesting thing. You go to the 27th of September, so 2 months later, and it's basically being dug up. And the experts, the military imagery experts identified digging equipment, a newly excavated trench, and basically, in essence, the Bosnian Serb for all. Somebody digging up bodies that had been buried back in July. The graves had been disturbed, the bodies were being moved. That's actually a photograph of the exhumation at Braniewo. It's a guy called Dr. Hagland, who was a forensic anthropologist who worked for the ICTY. This is an interesting one because this actually shows a secondary grave, and you can see how the bodies have been what the experts call commingled. That obviously the bodies are dug up, they've lost flesh, so the bones essentially all become mixed up together, and that's actually a very easy way of demonstrating that it is a secondary grave. This is an interesting one because how this was discovered was a French army officer was driving on this road after NATO forces had deployed into Bosnia, and it was raining very heavily. I mean, it's amazing the Bosnian Serb forces actually, they buried these bodies under a road, in the hope that, well, nobody's going to dig up a road, looking for these bodies. But the water, the heavy rainfall basically washed away the top of the road, and he's driving on it, and literally his car slides off the road. He gets out, and it's about 11 o'clock at night, very dark. I mean, and that's what he discovered. I mean, he very quickly got back in his car and drove off to headquarters and reported what he'd found, and then we came and basically exhumed that site. That's it again. You can see, unlike a primary grave site, all of the bodies are commingled because these are bodies that have been transported from another site. This is another one, end of October of 1995, so the killings took place in July. And again, the experts, the military imaging experts have identified a front loader basically digging up the grave site. So again, August, so 3 months later, they're there, somebody's digging up a primary grave site. That's an interesting one. I know it's a horrible photograph, but what that demonstrates, this was Nova Kasaba mass grave site. This was an individual who the forensic pathologist confirmed had a serious injury to his leg at the time that he was executed. Again, demonstrating that he couldn't possibly have been a combat casualty, because the forensic pathologist confirmed the man couldn't have walked with this injury. And indeed, within that gravesite, he was actually found on a stretcher, on a litter, executed, shot in the head actually, and with that injury. This, only a few more slides and I'm really nearly finished, but this is a very interesting witness, and there's a very nice story about this boy. And I'll read what he said, because at the end of his evidence, he was asked by the judge, do you have anything to add? He was 16 years old at the time of these executions. I led him in evidence, and he was, prior to giving evidence, was very actually reluctant to come forward. And then when he gave evidence, he gave the most extraordinary story. I remember Patricia Wald at the end of his evidence, you could have heard a pin drop at the courtroom, and the bench retired. And as she left, her microphone was still on, and she said to the other judge, that kid deserves a break in life, because his evidence was so powerful. And I'll read what he said. From whatever I've said and what I saw, I could come to the conclusion that this was extremely well organised. It was systematic killing, and that the organisers of that do not deserve to be at liberty. And if I had the right and courage in the name of all those innocents and all those victims, I would forgive the actual perpetrators of the executions, because they were misled. That's all. Now, he was a survivor of what's known as the Petkovsky Dam execution. He was 16 years old, captured, taken to a school, taken from the school to an execution site at a remote dam at a place called Petkovsky. He was on a truck, and people were literally dragged off the truck and then pushed forward, and there was a machine gun on a tripod, and as people ran out, they were literally, mown down with machine gun fire. The man in front of him tried to run, and so the machine gun traversed on the tripod to fire at the man that was escaping, and he and the boy went into the next row. By the time the gun had traversed back again, there was another 2 rows of people behind him. So as the gunner opened fire, basically the people behind the boy were killed, and literally the bodies all fell on top of each other, and he was alive under a pile of dead bodies. He had his hands tied behind his back. The next morning, the soldiers were coming around and executing the people who were still living, because a number of people had not been killed. And the man next to him was also, parallel to him. Next to him, obviously the people behind had protected him as well, but he'd actually suffered a serious injury to his leg from a round that had basically deflected off somebody else, and he was moaning. And a Serbian soldier literally came up with a pistol and shot him in the head. And it made such a mess on the boy, obviously the head injury to the man next to him, that the Serbian soldier didn't want to actually look at the boy to find out whether he was alive or dead. So when all of the soldiers left, the boy literally managed to get his hands free, climbed up from under the bodies, and found another man alive at the front of all of these bodies, and together they escaped. And he estimated, and it's very hard, I know, to estimate numbers of bodies, but we actually took him back to the dam site, and he was able to sort of basically, walk a line as to where all the bodies were. We estimate there were probably about 1,500 people killed at that site, and he and this other man were the only 2 known survivors. Now, the positive aspect of this story, years later, after President Clinton had finished his second term, through various contacts that I had, came to me and said that the president wanted to meet a survivor from Bosnia, because Clinton was doing a visit to Bosnia-Herzegovina. You recall in Kosovo and Bosnia, Clinton was loved, actually. He was really seen as somebody who'd done it, and indeed he had. I mean, he did a hell of a lot in the former Yugoslavia. And I identified this guy, and the plan was that Clinton would spend, I think, something like 15 minutes with him. And in the end, the boy met him at the Holiday Inn in Sarajevo, and Clinton spent nearly 2 hours with him and heard this story. And literally at the end, and I've seen the photographs. I mean, Clinton's there. I think President Clinton's quite an emotional man, and I think he feels it genuinely inside. And he's literally there holding the boy and weeping, having heard this story. And the boy, and I subsequently met Witness O because he was testifying in another case. He was absolutely delighted, having met, the President of the United States. So that was a small positive thing that came out of this. Sadly, every single male member of this boy's family was killed at Srebrenica. Not one of them survived. It's just now him, his mother, and 3 sisters. And another wonderful story about this boy, because I kept in touch with him through the Witness Protection Unit. There was a Swedish charity that was providing money for clothing for many of these people, because obviously, they were displaced within their own country, living in somebody else's house in Tuzla, none of their own belongings, they lost everything. And he was given, I think, 200 Deutschmarks, because at that time the Deutschmark was the currency that was in use in Bosnia. He was given this money to go and buy clothes. And somebody showed me the receipts, the witness unit, and he had spent something like 195 Deutschmarks on his mother and his sister, and he'd spent 5 Deutschmarks on himself for a t-shirt. I mean, he really was an absolutely wonderful kid. That's the point I'm trying to make to you. Having gone through all of this horror, he was an incredibly decent human being, and indeed, when he said these words, I think it had a profound effect on the court. This was a woman who was a social worker that was working with the surviving women from Srebrenica. And this was very interesting what she said, I thought, because again she was asked at the end of her evidence by Judge Rodriguez, do you have any further comments? And those of you who can't read it, I'll just read it. The Hague Tribunal, all the victims and the women with whom I've had a chance to work, has a very great significance for them. They expect that justice will be done. We believe we were members of a civilized society, of a society where goodwill will be compensated for and evil punished. They do trust that the real causes of what happened will be identified, and that the people will muster enough courage, including victims, to tell the story of what happened. Those who did it, that they too will be able to speak out so that we can all have a future, so that we can all have a basis for a common life together one day. Great expectations are being placed upon the tribunal. People expect that justice will be done and that the right decisions will be reached. I often use this quotation actually in Cambodia because I think in many ways it reflects often the people's expectation of what these courts can bring. And this was a lady, who'd worked with the survivors from Srebrenica. Most of them you can imagine, most of the men were killed. So she's working with women's groups in the area, trying to sort of help people rebuild their lives and get somewhere to live and find a way of surviving. And I find what she said essentially is the essence of what these courts are supposed to do. So, as I said, I use that a lot. Her name is Tufika Ibrahim Efendic. Very briefly and at the end, it's worth reading the Secretary General's report on Srebrenica, and these are a few extracts where this report actually came out 2 months before we started the first trial. And it was really a letter of apology from the United Nations for what happened in Srebrenica. And here, they were saying that basically the UN never learned. Srebrenica happened and then subsequently Kosovo. They say here, in both instances in Bosnia and Kosovo, the international community tried to reach negotiated settlement with an unscrupulous and murderous regime. In both instances, it required the use of force to bring a halt to the planned and systematic killing and expulsion of civilians. That report, interestingly, heavily relied on evidence that we had already gathered. So we had actually provided some significant amounts of evidence for the Secretary General's report. Again, another extract from the report. Again, I say to you, a letter of apology. They state, and this is the Secretary General, no one regrets more than we the opportunities for achieving peace and justice that were missed. No one laments more than we the failure of the international community to take decisive action to hold the suffering and end a war that had produced so many victims. Srebrenica crystallized a truth understood only too late by the United Nations and the world at large, that Bosnia was as much a moral cause as a military conflict. The tragedy of Srebrenica will haunt our history forever. That report is actually worth reading because it's a very interesting account of the UN failures in Bosnia. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that, as I say, is a very rapid journey through a long trial that I think profoundly affected all of us who worked on it, dealing with the victims who were extraordinary people, dealing with the evidence which you can see was extremely traumatic for many of the people involved in that trial. Krstić was eventually convicted, and just so I get it absolutely right, because I've had to check this, it's so many years now, he was convicted of genocide, persecution as a crime against humanity, and murder as a war crime. On appeal, a number of charges were accumulated, so essentially the crime of persecution essentially accumulated other charges that we had charged, but on appeal a conviction for extermination was re-entered, which had been dismissed at trial. At trial, he was basically found guilty of these crimes on the basis of what's called a joint criminal enterprise under 7.1, Article 7.1. So he basically was what Judge Shahabuddin said on appeal, a principal. On appeal, he was actually found guilty of aiding and abetting a joint criminal enterprise to commit genocide, which I've always had a great difficulty understanding as a legal concept. There's a very strong dissent from Judge Shahabuddin on appeal. Judge Shahabuddin found that he was still a principal, as the trial chamber had found, for genocide. And actually, if you want to read a very clear, for non-lawyers, if you want to read a very clear judgment, read Shahabuddin's dissent. Obviously, it's a dissenting judgment. It's a dissent from the majority, but it's beautifully written, and it actually makes a lot more sense than the main judgment. At trial, he was sentenced to 46 years, and on appeal, that was reduced to 35. And interestingly, as a sort of end note on all of this, he was sent to the United Kingdom to serve his sentence. And I think it's last year, maybe the year before, he was imprisoned, I think in Wakefield Prison, which is a high security prison, which also contains a number of convicted Muslim terrorists who'd been convicted quite recently with the problems that we had in the UK. And actually he was attacked and nearly died. He was basically stabbed in the neck with a bottle. They almost killed him as a result of what they found out about this man, that he'd been involved in the murder of these individuals. Anyway, thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Hey folks, just a note, the crowd is so big here, we're going to do Layla's speech here. We're not going to go up to Fletcher. We'll alert those people of Fletcher to come down. So we're going to take a 15-minute break, and then we'll commence here with the next speech.
I enjoyed it, good. Yeah, I've done that before. I've done that.